we're going to tackle the question of the credibility of Christianity by going right to the heart of it. Now, we could argue all sorts of ways about whether religion is a good or a bad thing, and I've made many videos on this in the past, but what's at the heart of it? Well, I think it boils down to this. Was Jesus a real person? Did he say the things he said, and did he do the things he did, especially the miracles, and of all the miracles, especially the resurrection from the dead? Now, it stands to reason, if all of this really happened, then I'm in real trouble, and I need to start doing something about that. And if it didn't really happen, then Christianity doesn't have a leg to stand on. Is that fair? I think that's fair. Who could really argue against that, whether Christian or non-Christian? It stands on whether Jesus was a historical character who did what he claims to have done. Now, a friend of mine from Canada several years ago purchased this book for me. It's called Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. This came hot on the heels of me declaring on my blog that I was no longer a Christian. This, I think, was in summer 2008. So it was a fairly, it was an attempt by my friend to try and talk some sense into me, I suppose. And, it was well taken. I wasn't offended that he wanted to do this. It's a huge, big book. Look at that. It's about 700 pages of fairly small print. Have a look at that. I haven't read all of it, but I have read vast portions of it from here, there, and everywhere, pretty much totaling probably about half of the book. And I'm always looking out for, how do I crystallize this? How do I, because I'm no scholar, I'm smart, but I'm not a scholar. I'm just trying to do my best with the information that's available to me. So, can we get to the bottom of this question? Was Jesus a historical character? And did he do the things that he claims to have done? Now, I think it's fair to say that any atheist who dismisses the New Testament and the Bible in general by simply saying, it's all a fairy tale, forget about it, that does a disservice to it, because there does seem to be some legitimate evidence that Jesus was a real person. There is the testimony of Tacitus, Suetonius, and a handful of other references from secular history. And even if we didn't have those references, I think it's fair to say that there was a real Jesus of Nazareth, for the simple fact that Christianity didn't spring out of thin air. It had to come from somewhere, and it's most likely to have originated with the character from which it originated from, a real Jesus, or Yeshua as the name would have been pronounced in the original Greek. So, the problem is not, did this man exist? The problem is, did he do the miraculous things that are written about him? And I would stand on the no side of this equation. He didn't. Now, the way that the book crystallizes this argument is, it compares the evidence for the New Testament with the evidence from other documents from antiquity, and it makes the claim, which is probably true, I'm willing to accept that this is legitimate, that there is more evidence for the New Testament than there is for any other document of antiquity. Okay? So, why do people not believe it? It comes down to this. Josh McDowell claims, and other Christian apologists claim, that the modern sort of atheistic critical thinker is bringing an anti-supernatural bias into the equation. Now, this is interesting because it made me think, is that necessarily wrong? So think about it. Is the natural position to simply accept, the supernatural, it's all real, I just accept it. If I read a supernatural claim in an ancient document, it must be real. No. Because is there any other document from antiquity outside of the Bible that we accept supernatural references in? No. I mean, Muhammad of Islam is a historical character. There are miracles claimed about him. Does the Christian accept those as legitimate? No. There's also a lot of New Testament apocryphal documents that are not accepted as legitimate New Testament scripture. And they also contain miracles. So the Christian scholar has no problem denying those miracles while accepting the ones in the actual New Testament documents, the ones that were eventually canonized into the Bible as we have it today. So there's a kind of an inconsistency here. And it kind of boils down to, we just have to admit that people were inclined to write miracles that didn't actually happen. So why do we bring this anti-supernatural bias in? Well, obviously because it's totally contrary to our experience. And how do we base what we know about life? We base it on our experience of life. And the supernatural, at least as far as I can tell for almost all of us, if not completely all of us, is absent. Well, let me use an example. I've used this before in another context, but it suits this context as well. Let's say I was at work and I ran into the office. I ran down the corridor and I ran into the office and I shouted, "Quick, everybody get out, there's a fire!" And I had a real serious expression on my face. Well, that's something believable. People would immediately jump to their feet and follow me outside to avoid a roasting. But what if I had decided instead to run into the office and shout, "Quick, everybody run, get out, there's a werewolf down the corridor and he's coming this way"? Do you think they would take me seriously? Of course not. Why? Because it's contrary to experience. So when we read miracles in history, that's an immediate red flag. That's a legitimate red flag that comes up and says, "Hey, am I really sure this happened?" So Josh McDowell takes the really simplistic stance that we have to use the same criteria in judging all books from history. And we can't treat the New Testament differently from other books, otherwise we're being inconsistent. But he's failing to understand that there's an awful lot of probability we're dealing with when we look at historical documents. And the best example of this is the Greek philosopher Socrates. Now, he's kind of a little bit like Jesus in the sense that he never wrote anything about himself. At least we don't have any documents to say that he did. Just like Jesus, we're relying on the testimony of others. Now, the two principal people who talk about Socrates are two of his pupils, Plato and Xenophon. And they both tell various stories about Socrates and about the things that Socrates believed. The trouble is, they both said different things. We don't really know for sure which one's telling the truth and which one's lying, or whether there's a mixture of truth and lies in both accounts. We just don't know. So the real historical Socrates is lost somewhere in the middle of these mixed accounts. Now, we can put together a picture, but if we're sensible, we should admit that this picture is only going to be partly historical and partly mythical. You know what I mean? So the same is obviously true of Jesus. There are various stories, apocryphal and otherwise, that were passed around about him, about various miracles. And there are no extra-biblical sources from secular history that can attest to the miracles of Jesus. Now, the big one for me is when he was on the cross, allegedly. Actually, we could admit he was on the cross. There's testimony to that effect. On the cross, the sun is supposed to have been darkened for a period of 3 hours. Now, you can't say this is an eclipse, because eclipses only last a couple of minutes. There was a 3-hour period where darkness fell all across the land. Now, you think something that unique would make it into the annals of secular history? But no, there's not a mention of this anywhere. Only in the Gospels. What is that telling you? It didn't really happen. Just like the resurrection from the dead didn't really happen. I mean, one of the principal references is by a guy called Tacitus, who talks about Christus, which is likely a reference to Jesus. But he refers to Christianity with the words, he calls it a mischievous superstition. So even these, these extra biblical sources for Jesus, they kind of work contrary to the validity of Christianity, because while they do admit to a historical person, they deny anything miraculous or special about this person, and they refer to this belief system, Christianity, as a mischievous superstition. So, this kind of crystallizes it for me. There is just no evidence for the miracles, so we don't believe in the miracles. It's just a historical document making claims. Like many other historical documents make claims about miracles, and we don't take them seriously, so why do we take the Bibles seriously? As I recall, even from the Old Testament, there was a reference, I can't remember exactly where this was, but there's a reference to the sun standing still for half a day, or something like that. If that really happened, what would that do? That involves the earth actually standing still in its rotation around the sun. What would that do to the tides? Think about it. If the miraculous really did invade ordinary experience to that extent, well, I suppose you could argue that God could stop the tides. God can do anything. But again, I think if the sun actually did stand still for half a day, maybe we'd have record of something that extraordinary from sources other than the Bible itself. But once again, we don't. So I concede that there was a historical Jesus. He had followers. He created a belief system. Those followers invented myths about him. And you needn't start talking to me about prophecy, because all you got to do when the documents are being written several decades after the death of Jesus, all you've got to do is retrofit prophetic fulfillments into the record of his life. And you can't say it didn't happen like that, because Christianity began with what's called the oral tradition of stories being passed around from mouth to mouth. And the process of how these oral traditions eventually became the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's hard to say. Nobody really knows. It's too far back in time. We've got too little information to rely on. So I'm going to recommend this book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It's great because it's a very comprehensive source about Christian apologetics. And if a Christian reads it and doesn't think too deeply, he might be convinced by the arguments. But it's a great source even for a skeptic like myself, to really get into the nitty-gritty of the good arguments against Christianity, and also to take note of the subtle little sneaky things that are done by Christian apologists. One that comes to mind is Jos McDowell remarks on the amazing consistency of the Bible as it's been written over a period of, is it 1,000 or 2,000 years? I can't remember. But it has this remarkable consistency about it. Well, that's debatable actually. But in terms of the consistency that it does have, he doesn't mention in this context, and it's very relevant, he only mentions this in a different context. When the bishops were putting together the Bible in the 4th century, in 393 at the Synod of Hippo, they gave themselves permission to omit any books that contradicted the existing teachings. So of course it would be consistent, since you're playing the game and you're holding all the cards. So there's really nothing amazing about the existing consistency of the Bible, but you really have to be on the lookout for those sneaky little arguments that don't hold any water. I'm just coming to the end of a chapter. Incidentally, there's a bookmark here, but I've read a lot more than that of the book. I just happen to be currently reading a chapter, Is the New Testament Historically Reliable? And he finishes with these words: after trying to shatter the historicity and validity of the Scripture, I came to the conclusion that it is historically trustworthy. If one discards the Bible as being unreliable, then one must discard almost all literature of antiquity. There's that very simplistic attitude that I've been talking about. One problem I constantly face is the desire on the part of many to apply one standard or test to secular literature and another to the Bible. One must apply the same test whether the literature under investigation is secular or religious. Having done this, I believe we can hold the scriptures in our hands and say the Bible is trustworthy and historically reliable. It's very telling, the way he says, having done this, I believe we can hold the scriptures. When someone says, I believe something, he's bringing a kind of subjectivity into it, It's like, well, you can believe something else, but I believe this. It really isn't a very good case for the miracles of Christ. In closing, I should probably say a word or two about the supernatural, because if you've frequented my channel before, you know that I dabble in psychic things, and I have a belief in what you might call the paranormal. It's very important to note that the paranormal and the supernatural are not the same thing. When you think about it, the prefixes para and super aren't the same, and they mean different things. Para means beside, as in parallel, two parallel lines, one beside the other. Super or supra means above. So to say that something is supernatural is to say that it is above nature. It invades nature from outside of nature. It's the miraculous, in other words, something that comes from God. But to say that something is paranormal is to say that it exists alongside the natural world. It is simply another part of the natural world, unrecognized. It's like, if you could go back in time and demonstrate, say, one of those doors that open and close with a sensor. And if you could pull somebody from the 15th century into the present day and walk him into a supermarket where the doors open and close on their own, he would look at that as if it's magic. But it's not supernatural. It would just be paranormal to him. And if he understood it, it would be normal. So my little dabblings into psychokinesis and stuff like that, they're paranormal. There is a natural explanation if only we could get to it. It's not supernatural. So just wanted to clarify that. But as for the miracles of the Bible, I see no reason whatsoever to believe in them, because they are completely contrary to experience, and they cannot be verified from any source of history other than the Gospels themselves.